The second attribute we're going to be looking at is God's infinity. And I think this is a pretty simple one, at least conceptually, and it simply means this. It's that what is true about God is going to be true without any form of limits whatsoever. And I think this is just best understood when it's illustrated, and so I just want to roll through a couple examples with you guys. The first one is when we think about the fact that God is good, His goodness is unlimited. His goodness has no bounds, and so we say that God is all good, or we say that God is omnibenevolent. Another one is when we think about God's knowledge. Our knowledge is limited, right? There are things that we do not know, but God's knowledge is unlimited. He knows all things, and therefore we say that God is omniscient. Next, when we think about God's presence, unlike our presence, which is limited by time and space, God is omnipresent. He is at all places at all times, and so we say that God is omnipresent. When we think about God's power, unlike our power, which is limited, God's power is unlimited, and therefore we say that God is omnipotent. And when we look into the scriptures, we see God's infinity at work everywhere. And, although it's such a simple concept, we see that God's people have a difficult time appreciating and remembering this. We deal with God as though God were finite, as though God was just like us. And, one of the first examples is in Genesis chapter 18, where God promises Abraham and Sarah in their old age that God will cause Sarah to conceive and bear a child. Sarah starts to laugh as she thinks, man, this is ridiculous, as if God is joking. And then God very sternly asks Abraham, hey, Abraham, is anything too hard, too difficult for the Lord? And so we find ourselves, although it's such a simple idea, we find ourselves doubting the power of God all the time. Isn't that right? Another one is in Romans chapter 11, verse 33. I love this one. Paul just explicates, he proclaims the gospel, the God's plan of salvation from the beginning to the end, and just how marvelous and how unpredictable it has been. And he comes to this conclusion. He says, oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. When he thinks about the mystery of predestination, of the Gentiles being saved and becoming a part of Israel, like this it's just mind-boggling to Paul. As Paul says, there are things that we don't understand about this universe. And that only points to the fact that God's ways are unsearchable. Our finite minds are incapable of grasping the true depth of God's wisdom and God's ways and God's knowledge. And so it's a confession of God's omniscience and God's unlimited wisdom as well. And lastly, Psalm 139, verse 7 through 8, it's a beloved psalm by many. And the psalmist, he considers God's omnipresence, the fact that no matter how alone the psalmist may feel, the psalmist comes to confess, God, you are everywhere at all times. I can't hide. I can't escape from your presence. You are always with me. And this is what he says. He says, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. It's such a beautiful reflection of the omnipresence of God. And so this concludes the second attribute of God's infinity as it touches every other attribute that we think about God.